Imagine a book so powerful that it has been banned by some, venerated by others, and continues to spark heated debates to this day. A text that tells of celestial warriors mounted on golden horses, martyrs who defied an empire, and a family of warriors who changed the course of history. This is the book of 2nd Maccabees, a work that goes far beyond a mere historical record. Within its pages, we find a story that begins with a mysterious letter sent to the Jews of Egypt, mentioning a sacred fire hidden in a dry well that miraculously reignites when exposed to sunlight. The book transports us to the turbulent 2nd century BC, when the mighty Seleucid Empire sought to eradicate the ancient Jewish religion, turning the sacred Temple of Jerusalem into a center of worship for Zeus. But what makes this book so special and controversial? Perhaps it is because it introduces revolutionary concepts such as the resurrection of the dead, the intercession of saints, and prayers for the deceased, ideas that would later deeply influence Christianity. Or perhaps it is its epic narrative of cultural resistance, in which a small nation refuses to abandon its identity in the face of a global empire. Interestingly, this text, originally written in Greek rather than Hebrew, began as a summary of a much larger work, 5 volumes written by a historian named Jason of Cyrene, now lost to time. What has survived is this condensed version, which would become one of the most influential and debated works of ancient literature. Our story begins at a crucial moment for the Jewish people, when the community of Jerusalem decided to send an important message to their brothers living in Egypt. As revealed in chapter 1, verses 1 to 9, this first letter was written in the 188th year of the Seleucid kingdom, corresponding to the year 124 BC. This was no mere communication, but a message of hope and unity in a period of great transformation. The Jews of Jerusalem begin their letter with a deeply significant greeting. In chapter 1, verse 1, we read, "To the Jewish brothers in Egypt, greetings. The Jewish brothers in Jerusalem and the region of Judea wish you true peace." These words reveal the strong bond that united Jewish communities, even when separated by great distances. Maintaining this connection was crucial, as Egypt was home to one of the largest and most important Jewish communities outside Jerusalem. The letter goes on to recall divine blessings and moments of hardship. In chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, the authors express their desire that, "May God bless you and remember his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his faithful servants." This reference to the patriarchs was not merely a formality, but a powerful reminder of the continuity of Jewish history and the divine promises that sustained them. The letter then addresses a particularly difficult period during the reign of King Demetrius in the 169th year of the Seleucid kingdom, 143 BC. As we see in chapter 1, verse 7, they write, "When Jason and his followers rebelled against the Holy Land and the kingdom, we prayed to the Lord and were answered." This event marked a time of intense persecution and internal conflict within the Jewish community, but it also demonstrated the strength of faith and prayer in times of adversity. One of the main objectives of this first letter was to invite the Jews of Egypt to participate in the festival of the Purification of the Temple, which would later become known as the Festival of Hanukkah. This celebration commemorated the rededication of the temple after its desecration by the Seleucid invaders, an event of immense religious and cultural importance, which would be detailed later in the book. The narrative then presents us with a second letter, even more extensive and revealing, found in chapter 1, verse 10 through chapter 2, verse 18. This letter was written earlier, in the year 164 BC, during the reign of Demetrius II, and contains surprising revelations about key events in Jewish history. This second letter begins with an extraordinary story about the sacred fire of the temple. As we read in chapter 1, verses 19 to 36, during the Babylonian exile, when the Jews were taken captive to Persia, the faithful priests made a bold decision. They secretly took the fire from the altar of the temple and hid it deep in a dry well. This was no ordinary fire, but the sacred fire that, according to tradition, had descended from heaven in the time of Moses and was never meant to be extinguished. Years later, when Nehemiah was sent by the Persian king to rebuild Jerusalem, he showed particular interest in recovering this sacred fire. As the text tells us in chapter 1, verses 20-22, Nehemiah sent the descendants of those priests to search for the fire. However, instead of fire, they found only a thick, muddy liquid. Following Nehemiah's instructions, they collected this liquid and brought it back to Jerusalem. What happened next was one of the most dramatic moments in this narrative. Nehemiah ordered the priests to sprinkle this liquid over the wood and the offerings prepared for sacrifice. In chapter 1, verses 22 to 23, we read that when the sun, which had been hidden by clouds, began to shine on the altar, something extraordinary happened. The liquid transformed into fire, completely consuming the sacrifice. This miracle was seen as a sign of God's continued presence among his people and of the legitimacy of the rebuilt temple. The letter then transports us to another crucial moment in history related to the prophet Jeremiah. In chapter 2, verses 1 to 8, we discover that before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, Jeremiah received a specific divine command. He was to hide 3 sacred objects of immense importance: the tent of meeting, which had accompanied the Israelites in the wilderness, the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the tablets of the 10 Commandments, and the altar of incense. Following this divine command, Jeremiah took these sacred objects to Mount Nebo, the same mountain where Moses had ascended to gaze upon the promised land before his death. There, he found a cave and placed these invaluable treasures of Jewish faith inside it. The text tells us that some of those who accompanied him attempted to mark the path so they could find the location later, but Jeremiah severely reprimanded them. In chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, he declares that these objects would remain hidden until God gathers his people again and shows his mercy. Then the Lord will reveal these things once more, and the glory of the Lord will appear, just as it did in the time of Moses. The letter goes on to mention another important aspect of the reconstruction work after the exile. In chapter 2, verses 13 to 15, we are informed that Nehemiah established a library where he gathered various important texts: the books on kings and prophets, the writings of David, and the letters from kings regarding offerings to the temple. This detail is particularly significant because it demonstrates a concern not only for preserving the physical objects of worship, but also for safeguarding the written memory of the people, their sacred and historical texts. Reaching the final part of chapter 2 in verses 19 to 32, the author makes a surprising revelation about the very nature of the book we are reading. The entire text of 2 Maccabees is, in fact, a summary of a much longer work originally written by a historian named Jason of Cyrene. The complete work consisted of 5 volumes that detailed the wars of the Maccabees against the Seleucid kings, Antiochus Epiphanes, and his son Eupator. The author explains his working methodology using an interesting metaphor. In chapter 2, verses 29 to 31, he compares his work to that of an interior decorator, in contrast to an architect who must be concerned with the entire structure. Just as a decorator focuses on beautifying and making the space pleasant, the author of this summary aims to make history more accessible and engaging for readers, leaving the meticulous historical research to Jason, the original author. This explanation of the composition method reveals much about the book's purpose. It is not merely a dry historical record, but a work that seeks to convey a spiritual message through historical events. The author makes it clear that his goal is to show how God acts in history to protect his people and uphold his covenant, even in the most difficult times. The writing style employed in the book reflects the influence of Hellenistic culture, which was dominant at the time. The author uses sophisticated Greek literary techniques, such as elaborate speeches and dramatic battle descriptions, while always maintaining a focus on the Jewish religious message. This blend of Greek and Jewish elements reflects the complex cultural reality in which the book was produced. The letters that open the book establish several important themes that will be developed throughout the narrative. The importance of maintaining religious traditions even in foreign lands, the constant presence of God in Jewish history, the value of martyrdom for the faith, the necessity of preserving the memory of significant events for future generations, and the certainty that God always comes to the aid of his people in times of need. This introduction through letters sets the stage for the dramatic events that were about to unfold. The story continues with a crisis that would shake Jerusalem to its core when the temple and its sacred treasures became the target of foreign greed, triggering a series of events that would forever alter the course of Jewish history. The narrative now takes us to a period of apparent tranquility in Jerusalem, which would soon be disrupted by dramatic events. As we learn in chapter 3, verses 1 to 3, the city was living in peace under the leadership of the high priest Onias III, a pious and dedicated man. The laws were strictly observed, and even foreign kings respected the temple, sending gifts and contributing to the sacrifices. During this period of prosperity, as we read in chapter 3, verses 4 to 6, a man named Simon from the tribe of Benjamin, who was an administrator of the temple, emerged. Driven by envy and ambition, Simon clashed with Onias III over the management of the city's marketplace. Failing to impose his will, he made a decision that would change the course of history. He went to Apollonius, the governor of Coele-Syria, and Phoenicia, with a disturbing piece of information about the temple's treasury. In chapter 3, verses 7 to 14, we see that Simon informed the governor that the temple's treasury contained an immense amount of wealth, far beyond what was necessary for the sacrifices. This news reached the ears of King Seleucus IV, who immediately sent Heliodorus, his finance minister, to confiscate this treasure. Heliodorus arrived in Jerusalem with clear orders to collect all that money. Tension rises as, described in chapter 3, verses 15 to 21, Heliodorus announces his intention to enter the temple. The high priest Onias tries to explain that part of the money belonged to widows and orphans, and another portion was owned by Hyrcanus, son of Tobias, a man of high standing. But Heliodorus insists that, by order of the king, all the money must be confiscated. What happens next is one of the most dramatic scenes in the book. In chapter 3, verses 22 to 30, while the priests prostrate themselves before the altar in prayer and all the people cry out to God, an extraordinary supernatural manifestation occurs. A terrifying horseman appears, clad in golden armor, mounted on a horse that charges at Heliodorus. Alongside the horseman, 2 young men of great strength and radiant beauty appear, who begin to relentlessly strike Heliodorus. Divine punishment is immediate and severe, as recounted in chapter 3, verses 31 to 34. Heliodorus falls to the ground, engulfed in great darkness, and must be carried away on a stretcher, completely incapable of helping himself. He, who moments earlier had entered the temple with his guards and all his authority, now lay powerless, clearly recognizing the power of God. The story takes a surprising turn when, as described in chapter 3, verses 35 to 40, Heliodorus' friends plead with Onias to intercede with God for his life. Demonstrating mercy, Onias offers a sacrifice for Heliodorus' recovery. The same young men who had punished him appear to him once more, this time telling him that he owes his life to Onias and that he must proclaim to all the power of the true God. Heliodorus's transformation is complete. In chapter 3, verses 41 and 42, he offers a sacrifice to God, makes solemn vows, and returns to the king, testifying about the extraordinary events he witnessed in the temple. When the king asks who could be sent again to Jerusalem, Heliodorus responds with wisdom gained through his harsh experience. If you have an enemy or someone plotting against your rule, send him there, and he will return scourged, if he even manages to escape alive, for there is truly a divine force in that place. However, peace would not last long. Chapter 4 reveals how ambition and politics begin to corrupt the priesthood. In verses 1 to 6, we see that Simon, the same man who had previously caused trouble, continues his intrigues against Onias III, spreading rumors that the high priest was responsible for the incident with Heliodorus and accusing him of conspiring against the government. The situation worsens when, as described in chapter 4, verses 7 to 10, following the death of King Seleucus IV and the rise of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Onias's brother Jason offers the new king a large sum of money to be appointed high priest. In addition to bribery, Jason promises to implement an extensive program of Hellenization in Jerusalem, including the construction of a gymnasium and the registration of Jerusalem's inhabitants as citizens of Antioch. The impact of this change is devastating for Jewish traditions. As we read in chapter 4, verses 11 to 17, Jason immediately begins introducing Greek customs among the people. A gymnasium is built just below the citadel, and young priests abandon the service of the altar to participate in athletic training. They go so far as to feel ashamed of circumcision and attempt to conceal it, thereby rejecting one of the most sacred signs of the covenant with God. But Jason's betrayal soon turns against him. In chapter 4, verses 23 to 26, after 3 years in office, he sends a certain Menelaus to deliver money to the king and handle important matters. Seeing an opportunity, Menelaus offers the king 300 more talents of silver than Jason had paid, thus securing the position of high priest for himself. The text tells us that Menelaus possessed none of the dignity of the high priesthood, but had the fury of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a wild beast. Menelaus's rule marks the lowest point of the priesthood's corruption. In chapter 4, verses 27 to 39, we see that, unable to pay the promised sum to the king, he begins looting the sacred vessels of the temple to sell them. When Onias III denounces this sacrilege, Menelaus conspires with Andronicus, a royal official, and manages to have Onias assassinated, even though he was under sanctuary protection in Daphne. Public outrage over the murder of Onias III is immense. As recounted in chapter 4, verses 40 to 50, various uprisings erupt in Jerusalem. During one of them, Lysimachus, Menelaus's brother, arms about 3,000 men and attacks the people, resulting in casualties on both sides. The enraged populace kills Lysimachus near the temple treasury. Yet, through bribes and political influence, Menelaus manages to retain power. The social transformations in Jerusalem during this period are profound. Forced Hellenization divides society between those who embrace the new customs and those who resist them. The traditional temple rituals are neglected, dietary laws are disregarded, and even the Sabbath loses its sanctity for many. Jewish identity, built over centuries, appears to be rapidly disintegrating. Cultural resistance, however, begins to organize. Many families continue to secretly observe the law, educating their children in ancestral traditions and refusing to partake in Hellenistic practices. This division in society would set the stage for even more dramatic events to come. when Judaism itself would be threatened by royal decrees attempting to eradicate the religion entirely. The situation in Jerusalem was about to become even more dire. As recounted in chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, for about 40 days, strange phenomena were seen in the skies over Jerusalem. Cavalrymen in golden armor appeared in the air, squadrons of horsemen in battle formation, drawn swords, troops moving, attacks and counterattacks on both sides. The people began to pray that these signs would turn into a good omen. During this same period, as we read in chapter 5, verses 5 to 10, a false rumor spread that King Antiochus IV had died during his campaign in Egypt. Jason, the former high priest who had been deposed by Menelaus, seized the opportunity and attacked Jerusalem with 1,000 men. Though he managed to take the city and force Menelaus to seek refuge in the citadel, his victory was short-lived. The rumor of the king's death was false, and when Antiochus learned of the revolt, he interpreted it as an uprising against his rule. Antiochus' reaction was brutal. In chapter 5, verses 11 to 14, we see that he marched against Jerusalem with an enraged army. He ordered his soldiers to kill mercilessly all whom they encountered, including those seeking refuge in their homes. The text tells us that young and old were massacred, women and children were slaughtered, virgins and infants were put to death. In just 3 days, 80,000 people perished. 40,000 were killed in the conflict, and another 40,000 were sold into slavery. But this was not enough to satisfy Antiochus' wrath. As described in chapter 5, verses 15 to 20, he had the audacity to enter the temple, guided by the apostate Menelaus. With profane hands, he seized the sacred vessels and the objects that other kings had dedicated to enhance the glory and honor of the place. The text tells us that Antiochus was so exalted in his pride that he failed to realize that it was because of the sins of Jerusalem's inhabitants that God had temporarily allowed this desecration of the holy place. The persecution intensified even further when, as we read in chapter 6, verses 1 to 11, Antiochus sent an Athenian senator to force the Jews to abandon the laws of their ancestors and cease living according to the laws of God. The temple in Jerusalem was desecrated and dedicated to Olympian Zeus. The altar was covered with offerings forbidden by the law. It became impossible to observe the Sabbath, celebrate traditional festivals, or even openly identify as a Jew. The text provides specific examples of the cruelty of this persecution. In chapter 6, verses 10 and 11, 2 women were denounced for having circumcised their sons. They were publicly paraded through the city with their babies hanging from their breasts and then thrown from the top of the city walls. Others, who gathered in caves to secretly observe the Sabbath when discovered, chose to be burned alive rather than violate the sacred day. It is in this context that the heroic figure of Eleazar emerges, one of the leading scribes, an elderly man of noble appearance. As told in chapter 6, verses 18 to 20, he was forced to eat pork, his mouth pried open by force. However, he chose a glorious death over a life of dishonor and willingly went to his suffering. The text reveals in chapter 6, verses 21 to 28, that some, moved by their long-standing friendship with Eleazar, took him aside and suggested a compromise. He could bring meat that was permitted by the law and only pretend to eat the sacrificial meat commanded by the king. That way, he could save his life. But Eleazar firmly rejected this proposal. In a moving speech, he explained that at his age of 90, he did not want young people to think that he, Eleazar, at 90 years old, had abandoned the traditions of his people. Eleazar's death, described in chapter 6, verses 29 to 31, was heroic. As he suffered under the blows, he cried out loudly, "The Lord, who possesses holy wisdom, knows that, although I could escape death, I endure in my body these severe pains." Under the lash, but in my soul I suffer them with joy, out of reverence for him. His death, the text says, left an example of nobility and a legacy of virtue, not only for the young but for the entire nation. Chapter 7 presents another even more dramatic account, the martyrdom of 7 brothers and their mother. As we read, in verses 1 to 6, 7 brothers, along with their mother, were arrested and forced by the king to eat pork. The first, speaking on behalf of all, said, "What do you intend to ask and learn from us? We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." What follows is a gripping narrative of courage and faith. In chapter 7, verses 7 to 19, we see how each brother, one after the other, faces horrific torture with extraordinary bravery. The first had his tongue cut out, his scalp torn off, and was burned alive. The second, before breathing his last, said to the king, "You, wicked man, take away this present life from us, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an eternal life, since we die for his laws." Each brother, before dying, professes his faith in resurrection and divine justice. In chapter 7, verses 20 to 23, the text offers special praise to their mother, calling her admirable and worthy of an honorable memory. She saw her 7 sons die in the span of a single day, but endured everything with courage, thanks to the hope she had in the Lord. To each son, she spoke in their ancestral language, filled with noble sentiments, combining a mother's tenderness with a strength of character usually attributed to men. The speeches of the brothers and their mother contain deep theological elements. As seen in chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, the mother speaks to her youngest son, "I beg you, my son, look at the sky and the earth and see everything that is in them. Recognize that God created them out of nothing, and that the human race came into being in the same way. Do not fear this executioner, but proving yourself worthy of your brothers, accept death, so that I may find you again with them in divine mercy." Here the book develops a theology of martyrdom that would later become highly influential. The central idea is that the suffering of the martyrs serves as atonement for the sins of the people. In chapter 7, verses 37 and 38, the last brother declares, "As for me, like my brothers, I give up my body and my life for the laws of our ancestors, beseeching God that he may soon be merciful to our nation. May my brothers and I be the last to suffer, so that the Almighty's wrath, which has justly fallen upon our whole nation, may come to an end." Hope in the resurrection is a central theme in these accounts. Each of the brothers expresses confidence that God will raise them to eternal life. This is one of the earliest clear expressions of belief in the resurrection of the dead in Jewish literature. The text emphasizes that it is this hope that gives the martyrs the strength to face death with such courage. The narrative concludes with the death of the youngest brother and their mother. As we read in chapter 7, verses 39 to 42, the king, enraged at being defied, treated the last brother with even greater cruelty. Finally, the mother also perished after witnessing all 7 of her children die before her. The text ends by stating, "Let what we have said about idolatrous sacrifices and cruel tortures be sufficient." These events deeply shaped the Jewish people's consciousness and established a model of resistance to oppression that would be followed for generations. However, the persecution continued, and soon a response more active than passive martyrdom would be required. This response would come through armed resistance led by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. Amidst intense persecution, a new form of resistance emerges. As recounted in chapter 8, verses 1 to 4, Judas Maccabeus and his companions began to act in secret, entering villages and calling upon their relatives. Gathering those who had remained faithful to Judaism, they managed to assemble around 6,000 men. Together, they pleaded with the Lord to look upon his people who were being trampled by all, to have compassion on the temple, which had been desecrated by the wicked, to take pity on the city, which had been devastated and was on the brink of destruction, and to hear the voice of the blood that cried out to him. The organization of the resistance, as described in chapter 8, verses 5 to 7, began with guerrilla tactics. Judas became a true terror to the Gentiles. Striking mainly at night, the fame of his exploits spread everywhere. His initial strategy was to carry out surprise attacks and then quickly retreat to the mountains, where they were well acquainted with the terrain. Seeing the growth of the resistance movement, as we read in chapter 8, verses 8 to 11, Philip, the governor of Jerusalem, sent an urgent request for help to Ptolemy, the governor of Coele-Syria and Phoenicia. In response, Ptolemy appointed Nicanor, son of Patroclus, one of the king's closest friends, giving him no fewer than 20,000 men from various nations with the mission of exterminating the entire Jewish race. Alongside him, he also sent Gorgias, an experienced general. Nicanor was so confident of victory that he planned to pay the king's tribute of 2,000 talents to the Romans with the money obtained from selling Jewish prisoners. As recounted in chapter 8, verses 12 to 15, he even sent messages to the coastal cities, inviting them to come and buy Jewish slaves, promising to deliver 90 slaves for 1 talent. Judas's response to this threat demonstrated his leadership skills. In chapter 8, verses 16 to 20, he gathered his men and encouraged them, not with weapons, but by recalling the help they had received from God in the past. He mentioned the defeat of Sennacherib's 185,000 soldiers and the victory against the Galatians in Babylon, where 8,000 Jews, with the aid of 4,000 Macedonians, had defeated 120,000 enemies. Judas's military strategy was innovative. As we see in chapter 8, verses 21 to 23, he divided his army into 4 parts, placing his brothers Simon, Joseph, and Jonathan as commanders of 3 divisions, each with 1,500 men. He himself led the 4th division. He ordered Eleazar to read the Holy Book and gave the war password, God's Help. The battle against Nicanor was a decisive moment. In chapter 8, verses 24 to 29, we read that, fighting with the Almighty, as their ally, the Jews killed more than 9,000 enemies and wounded most of Nicanor's army, forcing them all to flee. The money brought by those who had come to buy them as slaves fell into their hands. After pursuing the enemies for a long time, they turned back because it was the eve of the Sabbath. After the Sabbath, they divided the spoils, setting aside a special portion for those who had suffered persecution, as well as for widows and orphans. The victory over Timothy and Maccabees soon followed. As described in chapter 8, verses 30 to 33, after a common prayer, the Jews killed more than 20,000 men from the enemy armies and conquered several fortresses. They divided an enormous amount of booty, giving equal portions to those who had suffered persecution, to orphans, widows, and even the elders. The Maccabees' military equipment improved significantly with these victories. In chapter 8, verses 34 to 36, we read that they carefully collected the enemy's weapons and stored them in strategic locations. News of these defeats reached Antiochus, who was in the upper provinces, leaving him furious. Meanwhile, as recounted in chapter 9, verses 1 to 4, Antiochus IV was returning in shame from Persia. He had attempted to plunder the temple in the city of Persepolis, but the inhabitants rose up in arms and drove him out. It was during this retreat that he received the news of what had happened to Nicanor and Timothy in Judea. Enraged, Antiochus swore to turn Jerusalem into the graveyard of the Jews. However, as we read in chapter 9, verses 5 to 10, the Lord of Israel, who sees all, struck him with an incurable and invisible disease. As soon as he finished uttering his threats, he was struck with unbearable pain in his intestines and severe internal torment. The text tells us that this was only just, for he had tormented the intestines of others with numerous and unheard-of tortures. Yet he still refused to let go of his pride. As described in chapter 9, verses 7 to 10, overflowing with arrogance and burning with fury against the Jews, he ordered that the journey be hastened. But then he fell from his chariot in a violent rush, and the fall was so severe that his entire body was wounded. He who had once thought he could command the waves of the sea and weigh the mountains on a scale now lay on the ground, needing to be carried on a stretcher. Antiochus' illness worsened dramatically. In chapter 9, verses 9 and 10, we read that worms sprouted from the body of the wicked man. His flesh rotted while he was still alive, and his entire army could barely endure the stench of his decay. He who had once thought he could reach the stars of heaven now could not even be carried by others due to his unbearable odor. It was then that, struck by God and in inescapable pain, Antiochus began to abandon his great arrogance, as recounted in chapter 9, verses 11 to 17. When he could no longer bear his own stench, he said, "It is right to submit to God, and being mortal, not to think of oneself as divine." He promised to free the Jews, grant them the same rights as the Athenians, adorn the temple he had once plundered with magnificent offerings, return the sacred vessels multiplied, and personally cover the costs of the sacrifices. In a final act, as we read in chapter 9, verses 18 to 27, Antiochus wrote a letter to the Jews in the form of a plea. In it, he wished good things for the Jewish citizens, health and prosperity, and explained that, though he was ill, he still held affectionate memories of them and had decided to attend to their common interests. He did not despair over his condition, but had great hope of recovering. However, considering that his father, when undertaking expeditions in the upper provinces, had appointed his successor, he also designated his son, Antiochus, as king and commended him to the Jews. The chapter ends with the death of Antiochus. As described in chapter 9, verses 28 and 29, this murderer and blasphemer died suffering terribly, just as he had made others suffer, on foreign soil in the mountains, with a miserable death. Philip, his childhood companion, transported his body, but fearing Antiochus's son, withdrew to Egypt to Ptolemy Philometor. Judas's military victories were marked by supernatural elements. In several battles, as the text mentions, celestial horsemen appeared to aid the Jews. Prayers were always answered with divine manifestations, and the soldiers fought with the certainty of divine intervention. The fulfillment of ancient prophecies regarding the liberation of the people became increasingly evident with each victory obtained. With the death of Antiochus IV and the successive victories of the Maccabees, the path was open for the recovery of the temple and the restoration of traditional worship. Judas and his men now turned their attention to this sacred task, determined to purify and reconsecrate the house of God. After the great military victories and the death of Antiochus, Judas Maccabeus and his followers focused on a sacred mission. As we read in chapter 10, verses 1 to 5, they reclaimed the temple and the city. They destroyed the altars that the pagans had built in the public square, as well as places of idolatrous worship. After purifying the temple, they built a new altar. Using stones that produced sparks, they obtained fire and offered sacrifices for the first time in 2 years. They also restored the incense, the lamps, and the presentation of the bread. The restoration of the temple was a moment of great emotion. As we read in chapter 10, verses 6 to 8, they joyfully celebrated for 8 days, in a festival similar to the Feast of Tabernacles, remembering that not long before they had observed this feast in the mountains and caves, like wild animals. Now carrying branches and beautiful palm fronds, they sang hymns to the one who had granted them the purification of his temple. By public decree of the nation, they established that all the Jewish people should celebrate these days annually. However, peace would not last long. As we see in chapter 10, verses 14 to 23, while Judas was organizing religious life in Jerusalem, some of the refugees from previous battles, including Timothy, gathered mercenaries and began causing trouble. Additionally, the Idumeans, occupying strategic positions, harassed the Jews, and by sheltering fugitives from Jerusalem, prepared for war. Judas launched a campaign against the Idumeans. In chapter 10, verses 16 to 23, we see that he and his men, after invoking divine assistance, attacked the Idumean strongholds. Fighting fiercely, they captured the positions, expelled all those who fought on the walls, and slaughtered those they encountered, killing no fewer than 20,000 people. During these campaigns, there was a remarkable episode involving 9,000 enemies who had taken refuge in two well-fortified towers. As we read in chapter 10, verses 24 to 38, Judas left Simon, Joseph, and Zacchaeus with sufficient forces to besiege them and departed for other areas that required his presence. However, some of Simon's men, driven by greed, allowed themselves to be bribed by those in the towers, and for 70,000 drachmas, let some of them escape. When Judas learned of what had happened, he gathered the leaders of the people and accused those men of selling their brothers for money, releasing the enemies against them. As described in chapter 10, verse 37, he ordered the execution of the traitors and immediately seized the two towers. With complete success in his actions, killing more than 20,000 men in the two fortresses, he consolidated his power in the region. Diplomatic relations also intensified during this period. As we see in chapter 11, verses 1 to 12, Lysias, the king's tutor and relative, and the one in charge of the kingdom's affairs, unable to tolerate what had happened, gathered about 80,000 men and the entire cavalry and marched against the Jews. He planned to transform Jerusalem into a Greek city, turn the temple into a source of revenue like other pagan sanctuaries, and sell the position of high priest annually. The ensuing battle was marked by supernatural events. In chapter 11, verses 8 to 12, while the Jews and their allies pleaded with the Lord, a horseman in white garments wielding golden weapons appeared before them. Together they advanced, ready to strike down their adversaries. The text tells us that they had an ally from heaven by the mercy of the Lord upon them. After this astounding defeat, Lysias changed his approach, as we read in chapter 11, verses 13 to 15, being an intelligent man and reflecting on the defeat he had suffered, he realized that the Hebrews were invincible because the mighty God fought alongside them. He then sent peace proposals, willing to accept all fair terms and promising to persuade the king to become their ally. The negotiations resulted in a series of official letters preserved in chapter 11. In verses 16 to 21, we find Lysias' letter to the Jews, establishing peace terms. In verses 22 to 26, we see the letter from King Antiochus to Lysias, confirming the negotiations. In verses 27 to 33, there is the king's letter to the Jews, guaranteeing them the right to follow their own laws and customs. And in verses 34 to 38, we have the letter from the Roman ambassadors supporting the agreement. Religious autonomy was guaranteed by these agreements, but regional conflicts persisted. As recounted in chapter 12, verses 1 to 9, even after these treaties, some local governors continued to harass the Jews. In Joppa, for example, the inhabitants invited the local Jews to go on a boat trip with their families. But it was a trap. They took them out to sea and drowned them, killing a total of 200 people. Judas responded to these provocations with punitive campaigns. In chapter 12, verses 10 to 12, we see that he attacked Joppa at night, setting fire to the port and the ships, killing those who had taken refuge there. Likewise, in Jamnia, where a similar plot against the local Jews was being devised, he organized a night attack, burning the port and the fleet. The wars against the Hellenistic cities continued. As described in chapter 12, verses 13 to 16, Judas faced Gorgias, the governor of Idumea, in several battles. In one particularly challenging confrontation near a fortress called Carnion, where there was a temple dedicated to the goddess Atargatis, Judas achieved an impressive victory, killing 25,000 people. The protection of the Jews in the diaspora was a constant concern. In chapter 12, verses 30 to 45, we read about a campaign to protect the Jews living in Caspin. After a hard-fought battle, Judas managed to kill Timothy, who had caused great harm to the Jews. However, during this battle, it was discovered that some of the fallen Jewish soldiers had committed the sin of carrying idolatrous amulets under their tunics. This incident led to a remarkable action by Judas. As we read in chapter 12, verses 43 to 45, he organized a collection among his men, gathering 2,000 silver drachmas, which he sent to Jerusalem to have a sin offering made. The text praises this act, stating that he acted in an excellent and noble manner, considering the resurrection, because if he did not expect those who had fallen to rise again, it would have been pointless and futile to pray for the dead. The administration of the liberated territory required constant attention. Judas established a local government system, appointing judges in major cities and councils of elders to resolve minor disputes. Economic reconstruction was a priority, with special attention given to agriculture and trade. Religious institutions were reorganized, with the establishment of a legitimate priestly hierarchy and the regulation of temple services. Social reforms were also significant, as we can infer. From various passages mentioning the distribution of spoils, there was a particular concern for widows, orphans, and the poor. The justice system was established following the law of Moses, while also incorporating practical elements necessary for governing a growing state. The consolidation of borders remained a constant concern. Fortresses were built or reinforced in strategic locations, and military garrisons were established to protect Jewish communities. Military development continued, with the formation of a professional army complementing the volunteer forces that had initiated the revolt. The story reaches a critical moment when, as told in chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, in the year 149 of the Seleucid era, Judas received news that Antiochus Eupator was marching against Judea with a massive army. Alongside him was Lysias, his tutor and administrator of the kingdom. They commanded a Greek army of 110,000 infantry soldiers, 5,300 cavalrymen, 22 elephants, and 300 scythed chariots. The situation became even more complicated when, as we read in chapter 13, verses 3 to 8, Menelaus, the former high priest who had caused so many problems, joined them, encouraging Antiochus with false promises. However, the King of Kings stirred Antiochus' wrath against this criminal. When Lysias demonstrated that Menelaus was the cause of all their troubles, the king ordered him to be taken to Beroea and executed according to local custom. There, a 50-cubit tower filled with ashes had a rotating mechanism that caused the condemned person to fall into the ashes. Thus, Menelaus died without even the right to a burial. The military campaign of Antiochus V was remarkable. As described in chapter 13, verses 9 to 12, the young king advanced with barbaric intentions, determined to prove himself even more ruthless toward the Jews than his father. Knowing this, Judas ordered the people to invoke the Lord day and night, for never before had they needed his help as much as now, being at risk of losing the law, the homeland, and the holy temple. The use of elephants in this campaign is described in detail, As we see in chapter 13, verses 15 to 17, after organizing his men, Judas launched a night attack on the king's tent in the camp, killing about 2,000 men and the largest of the elephants along with its rider. Finally, having filled the camp with terror and confusion, they withdrew victorious. The subsequent peace negotiations were complex. In chapter 13, verses 18 to 26, we read that the king, having witnessed the boldness of the Jews, attempted to seize their fortresses through deception. He approached Beth Zur, a Jewish stronghold, but was repelled, attacked, and defeated. Judas ensured that the besieged had everything they needed. However, a Jew named Antiochus was secretly informing the enemy of Jewish strategies. He was discovered, arrested, and executed. The final agreement with Antiochus V was surprisingly favorable to the Jews. As we read in chapter 13, verses 23 to 26, the king negotiated with the inhabitants of Beth Zur, made peace with them, and withdrew. He fought against Judas but was defeated. When he learned that Philip, whom he had left in charge of the government in Antioch, had rebelled, he was dismayed. He then sought to make peace with the Jews, submitted to their conditions, swore to respect all their just demands, reconciled with them, and offered a sacrifice. However, internal conflicts persisted, as shown in chapter 14, verses 1 to 10. 3 years later, Demetrius, the son of Seleucus, took a seaport with a powerful army and fleet, killed Antiochus and Lysias, and seized the kingdom. Aldimus, who had previously been high priest and had voluntarily defiled himself during the revolt, realizing that there was no salvation left for him, nor access to the sacred altar, went to King Demetrius. The priestly disputes intensified when, as we read in chapter 14, verses 11 to 14, Alcimus presented the king with a golden crown, a palm branch, and also other branches that, according to custom, belonged to the temple. He accused Judas and his followers of inciting war and sedition, preventing the kingdom from achieving peace. The king then sent Nicanor, who had become the governor of the elephants, to serve as the governor of Judea. As described in chapter 14, verses 15 to 25, Nicanor initially attempted to capture Judas through deception, sending him messages of peace. There was even a meeting between the two, and Nicanor was so impressed by Judas that he advised him to marry and have children. Judas got married, lived a normal life, and enjoyed his days. However, this peace would be short-lived. As we read in chapter 14, verses 26 to 36, Alcimus, seeing the friendship between the two, once again went to King Demetrius and accused Nicanor of treason, claiming that he had appointed Judas, who was allegedly conspiring against the kingdom, as his successor. The king, enraged and infuriated by the slander of that scoundrel, wrote to Nicanor, expressing his deep displeasure with those agreements and ordering him to immediately send Maccabeus as a prisoner to Antioch. Nicanor's reaction to these orders shows how quickly politics could shift. In chapter 14, verses 37 to 46, he was dismayed and troubled at having to break agreements with a man who had done nothing unjust. But since he could not oppose the king, he awaited a favorable opportunity to carry out the order. Judas, noticing that Nicanor had begun treating him coldly and that their usual meetings had become more tense, realized that this severity did not bode well. He then gathered many of his followers and disappeared from Nicanor's sight. The conflict reached its climax when, as told in chapter 15, verses 1 to 5, Nicanor learned that Judas's men were in the regions of Samaria. He planned to attack them on the Sabbath, a day of rest. The Jews who accompanied him out of necessity tried to dissuade him, pleading with him to respect the day, sanctified by the one who sees all things. However, he arrogantly asked if there was a sovereign in heaven who had prescribed the observance of the Sabbath. Before the final battle, Judas had an extraordinary vision. As we read in chapter 15, verses 11 to 16, he told his men about a dream worthy of belief. Onias, the former high priest, a good and kind man with a venerable presence, appeared to him, praying with his hands extended for all the people of the Jews. Then another man appeared, admirable for his age and glory, wrapped in great majesty. Onias explained, "This is the friend of your brothers, the one who prays much for the people and the holy city, Jeremiah, the prophet of God." Jeremiah stretched out his right hand and gave Judas a golden sword, saying, "Take this holy sword as a gift from God. With it you will strike down your adversaries." The decisive battle was preceded by an inspiring speech from Judas. In chapter 15, verses 17 to 24, he encouraged his men not with shields and spears, but with excellent words, capable of stirring courage and strengthening the souls of the young warriors. He told them about his dream, an entirely credible vision, which filled them all with joy. The final confrontation with Nicanor was dramatic, as described in chapter 15, verses 25 to 36. While Nicanor advanced to the sound of trumpets and war songs, Judas and his men faced their enemies with prayers and invocations. Fighting with their hands but praying to God in their hearts, they struck down no fewer than 35,000 men, rejoicing greatly in God's manifestation. When the battle ended and they were withdrawing in triumph, they found Nicanor's body lying there, still clad in full armor. The treatment of Nicanor's body was symbolic. As we read in chapter 15, verses 33 to 36, Judas ordered that his head and right hand, the very hand he had raised against the holy temple of the Almighty, be cut off and brought to Jerusalem. Upon arriving, he summoned his compatriots and placed the priests before the altar. He commanded that the wicked Nicanor's tongue be cut into small pieces and thrown to the birds, and he hung the trophy of his folly before the temple. The book concludes by establishing a new commemorative festival. In chapter 15, verses 37 and 38, it was unanimously decided that this day should not pass unnoticed, but should be celebrated on the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar in the Aramaic language, the eve of the day of Mordecai. The author ends his work with humility. As we read in chapter 15, verses 38 to 40, he states that if the composition turned out to be beautiful and well-crafted, that was his desire, but if it was imperfect and mediocre, he did what he could. Just as drinking only wine or only water is not pleasant, while wine mixed with water is more flavorful and more enjoyable, so too is the art of arranging a narrative pleasing to the ears of those who read the work. And so we reach the end of this incredible journey through the book of 2 Maccabees, a story that even after more than 2,000 years continues to resonate in our time. This extraordinary narrative shows us how a people facing the possible extinction of their faith and culture found the strength not only to survive, but to triumph against all odds. What makes this book so special is not just its historical or religious value, but the timeless lessons it offers. We have seen how the courage of ordinary people, from mothers and their children to elders like Eleazar, can change the course of history. We have learned about the importance of remaining faithful to one's principles, even in the most adverse circumstances, and how faith can be an inexhaustible source of strength. This book, which has been banned in some religious traditions but preserved in others, also reveals the complexity of human history. It teaches us that the struggle for religious freedom and the preservation of cultural identity is not a new phenomenon, but a constant in humanity's journey. If this story impressed you as much as it did me, I invite you to share this video with friends and family. Stories like this deserve to be known and discussed, as they help us better understand not only the past but also our present. Subscribe to our channel to continue exploring other fascinating stories like this. We have much more content on historical books, ancient texts, and narratives that change the world. Leave a like if you learned something new today, and share in the comments which part of this story impressed you the most. And remember, just as the Maccabees preserved their history for future generations, we also have an important role in preserving and transmitting knowledge. Every time you share quality content, you contribute to a more informed and conscious world. See you in the next video, where we will continue our journey through the most impressive and transformative stories of humanity.